The House Rules Committee room felt smaller than usual that day, the air thick with a familiar scent of stale coffee, printer ink, and unspoken political grudges. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the long wooden table where members sat in their assigned seats. It was an emergency markup session on a continuing resolution, the kind of routine government funding bill that should have been straightforward. But nothing was ever straightforward when Chip Roy was involved. Roy strode in like a man entering his personal coliseum, tall, broad-shouldered, with a perpetual half-smirk of someone who believed he held all the cards. He represented the hard-right freedom caucus wing that delighted in disruption. These small committees were his playground, limited audience, C-SPAN cameras rolling, and enough procedural levers to grind everything to a halt if his demands weren't met. Republicans held a majority on the panel, so Roy and his allies could filibuster, object, and threaten to tank the entire bill unless they extracted concessions, real or symbolic, for their base. He dropped into his chair with theatrical flair, arms folded tightly across his chest, legs stretched out as if claiming extra territory. Around him, Republican colleagues exchanged quiet nods and small talk about weekend plans or the latest Fox segment. Democrats, by contrast, arrived with the weary expressions of people who had seen this movie before. They knew the next few hours would feature Roy's signature moves, constant interruptions, loud points of order, condescending lectures delivered with a Texas drawl that somehow managed to sound both folksy and superior. What Roy didn't realize was that Democratic leadership had made a calculated move this Congress cycle. They'd assigned Representative Jasmine Crockett, a former public defender from Dallas, known for her razor-sharp wit and unflinching demeanor, to the Rules Committee specifically to handle personalities like his. Crockett wasn't one to shrink from confrontation. She had spent years in courtrooms facing down aggressive opponents. A grandstanding congressman was just another bully in a suit. The hearing began with opening statements. The first Democrat barely reached sentence 3 when Roy's voice boomed. "Mr. Chairman, point of order." The objection was baseless, a procedural nitpick about wording that went nowhere, but its purpose was achieved. The speaker stumbled, lost his train of thought, and the rhythm broke. Roy leaned back, satisfied. 10 minutes later, he did it again. Then again 15 minutes after that, this time targeting a female freshman Democrat who was trying to speak passionately about veterans' health care funding. "Mr. Chairman," Roy interjected loudly, "I think the gentlewomen fundamentally misunderstand how the budget reconciliation process actually functions." He talked over her, his volume rising, until she faltered, her voice trailing off. She eventually yielded her time, cheeks flushed with frustration. Roy allowed himself a small, triumphant smile. This was power in his world, making others yield without ever raising a fist. Crockett sat quietly through it all, pen moving steadily across her notepad. She wasn't taking notes on the bill. She was cataloging Roy. The pattern was clear. He interrupted men occasionally, but women almost immediately. His tone shifted, more patronizing, more dismissive, when addressing female colleagues. She marked each instance, building her case silently. Then her amendment came up. It was simple and popular, language ensuring veterans' benefits could not be slashed in any future cuts. She began reading the text in her clear, measured voice. One sentence. 1.5. "Mr. Chairman, point of order." Roy's interruption sliced through the room like a knife. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't even look at him. She continued reading, word for word, as if he hadn't spoken. Roy raised his volume. "Mr. Chairman, I have a point of order that must be addressed." Still reading, Crockett replied evenly, "I have the floor, Mr. Roy. You will have your opportunity when I'm finished." Roy actually rose halfway out of his chair. "The gentlewoman needs to yield for my point of order. This is standard procedure." Crockett finally glanced over, calm as a summer lake. "I have not yielded, and I will not yield to someone who has interrupted 6 of my colleagues in the last hour alone. You can wait your turn." A stunned hush fell over the room. No one spoke to Chip Roy this way, not Democrats, not even most Republicans. The chairman cleared his throat uncomfortably. "The gentlewoman from Texas does have the floor." Roy sat back down heavily, face darkening. "Fine, but this amendment is completely unnecessary and redundant." "I'm still speaking, Mr. Roy." Crockett said pleasantly. In Texas, we're raised to have manners. You might consider trying them sometime. Laughter, stifled, shocked, rippled through the room. Someone had just openly mocked Chip Roy to his face in his own domain. Roy's voice rose sharply. Don't lecture me about Texas values. Then don't lecture me about interrupting women, which you do constantly, Crockett shot back. Sit down and wait your turn like an adult. Roy exploded. I will not tolerate this level of disrespect. Then stop disrespecting every woman in this room, she replied, voice rising just enough to match his intensity without losing control. You interrupt us. You talk over us. You condescend to us. I'm done allowing it. Democrats straightened in their seats. Someone was finally voicing what they'd all endured. Republicans looked uneasy. The behavior they tolerated as Chip being Chip was suddenly spotlighted, undeniable. The chairman tried weakly. Let's maintain decorum, please. I agree completely, Crockett said. Mr. Roy should start by maintaining some. Roy attempted to pivot to procedure. If the gentlewoman would yield for a question. I will not yield to someone whose standard practice is interruption, Crockett cut in smoothly. But I will engage with the substance of any question, if you actually have one. Roy's jaw clenched. My substance? Fine. Let's discuss this ridiculous amendment. Actually, Crockett interrupted again, turning his own weapon against him. Let's discuss your record. You spent this entire hearing tearing down everyone else's ideas. So tell me, Mr. Roy, what have you actually accomplished for the American people besides chaos, government shutdowns, and voting to overturn a free election? She reached into a bag and pulled out a thick, tabbed folder. Because I have your entire record right here, and I'd love to hear you defend it. Roy's face flushed crimson. I don't have to answer to you. You're correct, Crockett said, voice deadly calm. You have to answer to the American people. And right now, she pointed directly at the C-SPAN camera. They are watching. Crockett opened the folder to the first neatly labeled tab, January 6. She laid out documents with deliberate precision, the sound of paper against wood punctuating the silence. Let's establish a clear timeline, Mr. Roy. January 6, 2021. At 2:13 p.m., rioters breached the Capitol. By 2:30, the building was in full lockdown. By 2:45, we all saw the footage. Police officers being beaten with flagpoles, windows smashed, members of Congress being hunted through hallways by a violent mob. Were you aware of these events as they unfolded? Roy shifted in his seat, eyes darting briefly to his notes. Of course I was aware. We all were. Good, Crockett continued. So you knew this was an insurrection. You knew people were being injured, some severely. You knew democracy itself was under violent attack. And yet, when we reconvened at 8:06 p.m. that night, after the building was cleared, after the tear gas had dissipated, after we'd all witnessed the full horror, you still voted to reject Pennsylvania's certified electoral votes. Why? Roy reached for his standard talking points. I had legitimate constitutional concerns about the procedures used in several states. Be specific, Crockett interrupted sharply. What exact constitutional issue justified attempting to overturn the result of a presidential election after a violent mob had just tried, and failed, to do the exact same thing? Roy paused. There were irregularities in the election process. Questions about mail-in ballots, observer access. Name one, Crockett pressed. Name one specific, provable irregularity in Pennsylvania that would have altered the outcome. Joe Biden won that state by over 80,000 votes. Name one thing that could have changed that margin. Roy opened his mouth, closed it, glanced down at his papers again. Nothing came out. You can't, Crockett said quietly, almost gently, because there weren't any. 63 separate courts, including many with Trump-appointed judges, reviewed the evidence and found no widespread fraud. Bill Barr, Trump's own attorney general, said the same. Every Republican Secretary of State in battleground states certified the results. But despite all that evidence, you voted to overturn anyway. She pulled out an old press release and held it up. You know who else led the charge to object to the electoral votes? Your former boss, Senator Ted Cruz. You served as his chief of staff when he publicly announced he would object on January 6th. Did you help develop that strategy? Roy's tone hardened. I worked for Senator Cruz, but my votes and my decisions were my own. Were they? Crockett asked, reading from the document. Because your floor speech at 9:47 p.m. that night, after the violence, uses language remarkably similar to Cruz's earlier statements. We must ensure the integrity of our electoral processes and address the legitimate concerns of millions of Americans. Sound familiar? Here's Cruz from earlier that day. We must address the serious allegations and ensure electoral integrity for millions of concerned Americans. Same phrasing, same structure, almost as if someone who spent years drafting Cruz's speeches wrote yours too. Roy started to protest, but Crockett kept going. This wasn't a last-minute constitutional epiphany. This was coordinated, planned. You were part of the effort to overturn an election from the beginning. She leaned forward slightly. But here's what truly troubles me, Mr. Roy. You describe yourself as a law and order conservative. You put back the blue in your social media bias. You talk about supporting police. Yet on January 6, 140 Capitol Police officers were injured, some with traumatic brain injuries they'll carry for life. One officer died by suicide shortly after, and by voting to object after that violence, you sent a clear message to the rioters. Your actions mattered. Your violence achieved something. Your cause had legitimacy. Roy raised his voice defensively. I never supported violence. I condemned it repeatedly. You may have condemned it in words, Crockett replied, but your vote told a different story. You gave the mob's actions retroactive validation, and in the years since, you continued to minimize what happened. You called the January 6th Select Committee a partisan witch hunt. You referred to convicted rioters as political prisoners. You voted against legislation to award medals to the officers who defended the Capitol that day. Roy tried again. I believe some individuals are being unfairly prosecuted. They broke into the Capitol. Crockett cut in. They assaulted police officers. They tried to stop the peaceful transfer of power after a free and fair election. That isn't persecution. That's accountability. That's justice. She gathered the January 6 documents and set them aside carefully. Perhaps you still believe your objection was principled. Perhaps you think the rioters were just patriotic Americans with concerns. Fine. Let's move on to what you've actually done in Congress since then. Because you've been here for years now, and the one thing everyone knows you for is obstruction. She flipped to a new tab labeled McCarthy Speaker Fight. Let's start with Kevin McCarthy. In January 2023, you voted against him for Speaker 15 times. You helped hold the House hostage for 4 full days, preventing the chamber from organizing, assigning committees, or doing any real work. What exactly were you trying to accomplish? Roy sat back, arms crossed again. I was fighting for conservative principles, for reforms to the way the House operates, for fiscal responsibility. Which reforms? Crockett asked. What concrete changes did you secure that justified paralyzing the entire House for nearly a week? We received commitments, Roy said. Commitments to rules changes, to greater transparency, to spending restraint. Commitments, Crockett repeated flatly. Promises that Kevin McCarthy broke within weeks of finally taking the gavel. But you certainly got plenty of media attention out of it. In January 2023 alone, you appeared on Fox News 27 times, more than any other member of Congress, talking about your principled stand, your fight for conservatism. Meanwhile, the American people got a dysfunctional House, delayed legislation, and zero progress on the issues they actually care about. Roy, we were holding leadership accountable. You were performing for television, Crockett countered. And once McCarthy was finally elected, you voted for the very same debt ceiling increase and appropriations packages you had publicly sworn to oppose, only after it was clear they had the votes to pass anyway. You got nothing tangible. Just headlines. She moved to the next section. But the McCarthy drama was just theater. The real hostage-taking came during the 2023 debt ceiling crisis. You were among the loudest voices threatening to let the United States default on its obligations, risking economic catastrophe unless Democrats agreed to massive spending cuts. That isn't governing, Mr. Roy. That's holding the full faith and credit of the United States hostage. Roy's face reddened further. We were fighting against reckless government spending that's bankrupting future generations. Were you? Crockett asked, pulling out his voting record. Because let's examine what you consider reckless. You voted yes on the 2017 Trump tax cuts, which added $2 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. You voted yes on defense spending increases totaling more than $150 billion over 2 years. You voted yes on farm subsidies that overwhelmingly benefit large agribusinesses. But when it came to expanding the child tax credit to help working families, no. Increasing funding for school lunches, no. Providing health care for veterans exposed to toxic burn pits, no. She laid the record down. You're perfectly comfortable adding to the deficit when the money flows to wealthy individuals, defense contractors, and corporate interests. You only become a deficit hawk when the spending might actually help ordinary working people or vulnerable populations. Roy sputtered. That's a gross mischaracterization of my position. Is it? Crockett asked. During the debt ceiling fight, you specifically demanded work requirements for Medicaid, cuts to SNAP benefits, and a freeze on domestic discretionary spending, which would have meant reductions to education, environmental protection, housing assistance, and more. But defense spending? Untouched. Oil and gas subsidies? Untouched. Tax breaks for the ultra-wealthy? Untouched. She leaned forward. You created a crisis. You spooked financial markets. You risked pushing the country toward recession. And in the end, you voted for a deal that gave you almost nothing of what you demanded. All you got were more opportunities to appear on cable news. Crockett paused, letting the words settle. But your pattern of obstruction has consequences far beyond Washington. Let's talk about something much closer to home. Let's talk about Uvalde. Roy visibly flinched at the mention of Uvalde. For the first time, the confident posture cracked. Crockett reached into a folder and pulled out not another stack of documents, but photographs. She held up the first one, a colorful elementary school building with murals of smiling children on the exterior walls. Robb Elementary School, Uvalde, Texas. Your congressional district, Mr. Roy. May 24, 2022. 19 children and 2 teachers murdered in 19 minutes. The deadliest school shooting in Texas history. She set the photo down gently and picked up another, a makeshift memorial outside the school. Teddy bears, flowers, handwritten notes, balloons slowly deflating in the Texas heat. I traveled to Uvalde 6 months after the shooting. I met with grieving parents. I walked through the memorial. I listened to stories of children who loved art, soccer, reading, who had their entire future stolen in seconds. Her voice remained steady, but an undercurrent of emotion ran beneath it. What did you do, Mr. Roy, as a congressman? Roy cleared his throat. I visited Uvalde multiple times. I met with families. I attended memorials. I offered my support. Support in words, Crockett said. But what about action? What legislation did you support to ensure nothing like this ever happens again in your district or anywhere else? Silence. What gun safety reforms did you champion? She pressed. More silence. Crockett answered for him, reading from his voting record. After Uvalde, Congress passed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, the most significant gun violence prevention legislation in nearly 30 years. It expanded background checks for buyers under 21, closed a boyfriend loophole for domestic abusers, funded red flag laws, and invested in school safety and mental health. You voted no. Roy found his voice. That bill still infringes on Second Amendment rights. I support constitutional carry and law-abiding citizens' right to defend themselves. 19 children, Crockett said, her voice cutting through his defense like a blade, were murdered by an 18-year-old who legally purchased 2 AR-15 style rifles and over 375 rounds of ammunition just days after his birthday. He walked into a store, passed no meaningful check, and walked out with weapons designed for mass casualties. And your response was to oppose even modest reforms to make that harder. She pulled out printed statements Roy had given in the weeks following the shooting. June 2nd, 2022, Texas radio interview. The problem isn't guns. The problem is fatherlessness, mental health issues, cultural decay, the breakdown of the family and community. Crockett set the paper down. You blame fathers. You blame culture. You blame society. You blamed everything except the easy access to military-style weapons that actually killed those children. Roy tried to interject. There are multiple contributing factors. There is one factor that matters most in this context, Crockett interrupted. The weapon. Those children weren't shot by fatherlessness. They weren't shot by cultural decay. They were shot by high-velocity bullets from a rifle designed to inflict maximum damage in minimum time. She pulled out printed testimony from congressional hearings. I have statements here from Uvalde parents who came to Washington to beg for change. Kimberly Matarubio, whose daughter Lexi was killed, testified before Congress. She described holding her dying child. She asked for universal background checks, raising the age to purchase AR-15s to 21, red flag laws to keep weapons from dangerous individuals. These are reforms supported by the majority of Americans, including the majority of gun owners. She looked directly at Roy. What did you tell those families when they asked for your support? Roy, I told them I would work to make schools safer through hardened security measures, better training for law enforcement. Security didn't stop Uvalde, Crockett said. An armed school resource officer was present and did nothing effective. Teachers died shielding children with their bodies. The only thing that would have meaningfully reduced the likelihood of this massacre is if the 18-year-old couldn't have legally purchased those weapons so easily. She produced financial disclosure forms. But I think we both know why you refused. You've accepted thousands of dollars from the NRA and gun manufacturers. When you had to choose between your donors and the families of 19 murdered children in your own district, you chose the donors. Roy's voice rose angrily. That accusation is offensive and beneath the dignity of this committee. What's offensive, Crockett replied, matching his volume for the first time, is 19 dead children and your refusal to do even the bare minimum to prevent the next tragedy. That is offensive. Thoughts, prayers, and nothing else that is offensive. The room was completely silent except for the faint hum of the ventilation system. Crockett's hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from controlled fury of someone who had seen too much suffering ignored. She gathered the Uvalde materials carefully, as if handling something fragile. Those families will never recover. Those children will never come home. Uvalde will carry that trauma for generations. And you, their representative in Congress, failed them completely. You didn't just fail to act. You actively opposed the modest changes that might have made a difference. And you don't even seem to carry the shame of it. Roy sat rigid, unable to find words that wouldn't make things worse. Crockett took a measured breath, regaining full composure. But Uvalde isn't the only failure in your district. Let's talk about another issue you've made your personal brand, the southern border. Crockett opened a new section of a folder, this one filled with photographs of Roy at the border. There he was, in a green tactical vest, standing beside Border Patrol agents, pointing at the Rio Grande, looking stern in front of sections of border wall. Dozens of images, photo ops, press conferences, live shots for Fox News. You've built your entire public identity around border security, Mr. Roy, she began. You visit the border more than almost any other member. You give speeches about the invasion. You appear on television weekly warning about the crisis. So surely, with all this time, attention, and energy, you've actually accomplished something meaningful on this issue. Correct. Roy tried to frame it positively. I've been to the border dozens of times. It's important to see the situation firsthand, to talk to agents, to understand the challenges. Dozens of times, Crockett repeated. I counted. Dozens of photo ops. Dozens of press conferences. Dozens of Fox News stand-ups. So with all that visibility, what concrete legislation have you authored and passed to actually fix the problems at the border? Silence. Let me help, Crockett said. The answer is nothing. You've passed no meaningful border security legislation. Worse, you've actively voted against bipartisan solutions that would have made real improvements. She pulled out a summary of the 2024 bipartisan border security bill. This legislation was negotiated for months by Republican Senator James Lankford and Democrat Senator Chris Murphy. It was the toughest border enforcement package in decades. Hundreds more Border Patrol agents, more asylum officers, expedited removal authority, mandatory detention for certain cases, new authority to shut down the border when crossings exceeded specific thresholds. It included almost everything Republicans had demanded for years. She looked up, and you helped kill it. Why? Roy's response was defensive. That bill didn't go far enough. It still allowed too much catch and release. It didn't address root causes. It went exactly as far as Republicans had publicly demanded for years, Crockett countered. But the moment it had a realistic chance of passing, when it might actually have solved part of the problem, you opposed it. Why? Because if the border situation improves significantly, you lose your most powerful political issue. You need the crisis to continue. You need chaos and disorder so you can point at it, blame Democrats, and raise money off the anger. She produced several fundraising emails sent by Roy's campaign in the weeks after the bill's collapse. Subject lines: border invasion continues unabated. Democrats refuse to secure our border. Crisis at the southern border worsens. You helped kill a serious border security bill, then immediately turned around and fundraised off the fact that the problem persisted. Roy tried to object. That's a completely cynical interpretation. Is it cynical to point out the pattern? Crockett asked. You talk about law and order. You talk about following the law. Yet you supported Governor Abbott's efforts to have Texas take unilateral control of the border, defying federal authority and federal court orders. You applauded when Texas began busing migrants to blue cities as a political stunt. Do you believe states should have the right to override federal immigration law when they disagree with it? Roy attempted nuance. When the federal government fails to enforce the law, states have to step up. Yes or no, Mr. Roy? Crockett pressed. Can states selectively ignore federal law on immigration when it suits them? Yes or no? It depends on the circumstances. No, it doesn't, she said. Either you believe in federal supremacy on immigration, which is explicitly granted in the Constitution, or you don't. You can't claim to be for law and order while cheering state defiance of federal law. She pulled out additional images: overcrowded detention facilities in his district, children in chain-link enclosures, reports of insufficient medical care. These are conditions of facilities in your own congressional district. You visited them. You've seen the overcrowding, the suffering, and you voted against additional funding to improve those conditions. Why? Roy's answer was cold. We shouldn't be making detention comfortable. That only encourages more illegal immigration. Many of those people are asylum seekers, Crockett replied, which is a legal process under both U.S. law and international treaties. They are not criminals. They are human beings fleeing violence and poverty. And you're comfortable with them suffering in detention because you believe it sends a message. She closed the border section. Here's the truth, Mr. Roy. You don't actually want to fix the border. Fixing it would deprive you of your most potent campaign issue. You need it to remain broken so you can continue grandstanding, fundraising, and appearing on television. You've chosen performance over governance. She opened her final major section. But perhaps you'd argue that's unfair. Perhaps you'd say your core principle is fiscal conservatism, fighting against wasteful government spending. So let's examine that claim closely. Crockett displayed a simple chart tracking the federal deficit by year. You rail against government spending. You threaten shutdowns over deficits. You demand cuts to social programs. Let's see how consistent you've been. She pointed to key votes. 2017. Trump tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy added $2 trillion to the deficit over 10 years. You voted yes. 2018 through 2020, defense spending increases totaling hundreds of billions. You voted yes every time. Large farm subsidies for corporate agriculture? Yes. Oil and gas subsidies for profitable energy companies? Yes. She contrasted. But expanding the child tax credit, which lifted millions of children out of poverty? No. Additional school lunch funding? No. Health care for veterans exposed to toxic burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan? No. Child care assistance for working families? No. You're not a fiscal conservative, Crockett concluded. You're comfortable exploding the deficit when the money benefits wealthy donors, defense contractors, and corporations. You only pretend to care about deficits when the spending might help working families, children, or the poor. Crockett began gathering all her materials, the January 6 transcripts, the Uvalde photographs, the border images, the fiscal voting records, into a single, organized stack. The visual weight of it was undeniable, years of a congressional career reduced to a pile of documented failures. "Mr. Roy," she said, looking directly at him, "I want to ask you one final question, and I'd appreciate an honest answer if you're capable of giving one. What exactly have you accomplished in Congress beside performing for Fox News and creating chaos?" Roy opened his mouth. "I represent the values of my constituents." "By doing what?" Crockett interrupted. "By shutting down the government multiple times? By voting against veterans' health care? By doing nothing after 19 children were murdered in your district? By killing bipartisan border security legislation? Name one significant bill you've authored that actually became law. Just one." Roy hesitated. "I've introduced important legislation." "I asked what you've accomplished," Crockett said, "not what you proposed. What problems have you solved? What legislation have you passed? In 3 years, you haven't passed a single bill of substance, but you appeared on Fox News 247 times. I counted. That's more than one appearance every 5 days. You're on television constantly, but you delivered nothing legislatively because that's not your purpose here. Your purpose is performance." She leaned forward. "You've built your career on being the loudest voice in the room, on interrupting colleagues, particularly women. You did it 6 times in this hearing before I pushed back. You think that aggression equals strength. You think talking over people makes you dominant. But that's not strength. That's weakness masquerading as toughness. People who can win arguments with facts and logic don't need to shout over others." Roy began to interrupt, proving her point, but Crockett's voice cut through like steel. "I'm not finished, Mr. Roy. For once in your life, you're going to sit and listen while someone else speaks." The authority in her tone made him actually lean back. "You're a bully," she continued, "and bullies are always weak underneath. They can't compete on substance, so they try to dominate through intimidation and volume. But I don't intimidate easily. And now that I've called you out, everyone watching can see what you truly are, not a principled conservative warrior, but someone who is loud, mean, and fundamentally ineffective." She pulled out one final document, an article quoting Republican senators criticizing Ted Cruz. "You know who else operated exactly this way? Your old mentor, Ted Cruz. Grandstanding, shutting down the government in 2013, accomplishing almost nothing except headlines and hatred from his own colleagues. You interned for him. You worked for him. You learned from him. And you're repeating exactly the same mistakes." Crockett read from the article. Senator Cruz mistakes theatrics for leadership and confuses attention with accomplishment. That was said by a fellow Republican senator about Cruz. It applies perfectly to you. She gathered everything one last time. "When I look at your record, I see someone who came to Congress not to solve problems, but to build a personal brand. Someone who cares more about his next television appearance than about his constituents. Someone who let 19 children in his district be murdered and did nothing meaningful afterward. Someone who grandstands about the border but kills actual solutions. Someone who claims fiscal conservatism while voting to explode the deficit for the wealthy." Her voice dropped, became almost pitying. "You came into this room today thinking you could treat me the way you treat every other woman on this committee. Interrupt, talk over, condescend, dominate. But I don't back down from bullies. I don't yield to men who mistake volume for validity. And I don't let people like you pretend to be effective when you accomplish nothing of substance." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "You're not a fighter, Mr. Roy. You're not a conservative warrior. You're an empty suit with a loud voice and a television contract. And now everyone watching knows it." The room remained silent for several long seconds. Roy sat gripping his papers, face flushed, unable to find any response that wouldn't dig the hole deeper. The chairman cleared his throat weakly. "Perhaps we should return to the amendment under consideration." But the moment had passed. The hearing continued in awkward, subdued fashion. The amendment passed. The bill moved forward. But no one was discussing policy anymore. Within minutes, clips flooded social media. I'm not finished. For once, you're going to sit and listen. 3 million views in the first hour. You're just an empty shoot with a loud voice and a Fox News contract. 5 million by evening. The Uvalde line, 19 children died and you did nothing, became a rallying cry for gun safety advocates. The political fallout was swift and brutal. Democrats found new energy in calling out obstruction. Republicans whispered that Roy had finally gone too far. Within a year, he announced he wouldn't seek re-election, officially for family time. But everyone understood. His brand was broken. He couldn't win a primary or general anymore. Years later, Jasmine Crockett reflected on the moment in speeches. Bullies only win when good people stay silent. When you have the facts, the moral ground, and the courage, don't yield. Fight back. The confrontation became a case study in accountability, proving that even the loudest voices can be silenced by truth, preparation, and unflinching resolve.